Hello. In episode 32 of Airs for Architecture, Albena Yaneva, Professor of Architectural Theory and Director of the Manchester Architecture Research Group at the University of Manchester, revisits the podcast to speak about her recent book, Architecture After COVID, published by Bloomsbury this year.
They all adapted different tactics, protocols, gestures, we might say, from the laboratory and from the field of medical diagnosis. And all these technologies, gestures, and protocols such as wearing masks, for instance, or disinfecting, or temperature measuring, or quarantining. So these are all practices and protocols that we usually follow either in a laboratory or in a hospital. And suddenly we saw those practices and protocols migrating into the city, and they started reshaping spatial practices and urban practices. So by a laboratorization, in a way, I mean that on the one hand, we as urban dwellers, as citizens, were turned into subjects, but also participants in these experiments.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of A is for Architecture. I'm talking once again to Professor Albena Yaneva of the Manchester School of Architecture, Manchester Architectural Research Centre. Albena, you can introduce yourself, but maybe we can kick straight off because we're talking today about your new book, Architecture After COVID, which you published this year with Bloomsbury. So maybe we can just go straight into that. Like maybe what drove you to write this book? I mean, it seems like rather an obvious question.
Yeah, thank you, Ambrose. It's a pleasure to be here again and in conversation with you. I was, of course, quite intrigued by all the changes that COVID has triggered at many levels. This virus, absolutely uninvited, of course, a virus in our lives, in our homes, also started transforming urban space, and started transforming the way we live in cities. It also started modifying the reality of architectural practices, and I was quite intrigued by all these transformations, and I wanted to describe them anthropologically, ethnographically. So on the one hand, and I'm pretty sure you have experienced this as a urban researcher, as an architect, we have witnessed this kind of surreal phenomena of empty cities that are usually so crowded, like New York or in the middle of the pandemic, or London's tube in the middle of the pandemic, completely deserted. So this was a completely surreal phenomenon. I think we were all, in a way, walking in these empty cities, and we were thinking about the future of urban design, the future of architecture, the future of social connectivity in cities. This was really the moment when I started thinking as a sociologist as well, because I was trained initially in sociology. I was thinking what is at stake here. And I was particularly intrigued by the power of this virus to intrude in our life. This kind of very fragile non-human that the virus is, actually started transforming lives and urban dynamics in an unprecedented way. We also saw in cities all these new technologies, new materials like Perpex and plastic and temperature measuring robots and all these kind of contactless technologies. And we started also sharing urban space with these technologies, with these new non-humans, so to say. And this gradually began transforming social links in cities. Societies, entire societies got reorganized. And on the other hand, at the level of the practice, we witness all these amazing transformations at the level of exchange of images, technological innovations. And I wanted to capture also this moment, this transformative moment at the level of practice, architectural design practice.
Thank you. That was really clear. I asked my daughter and my wife this morning, what question would they ask Albena Yaneva about architecture and COVID? I asked my daughter first, because children see things strangely clearly, don't they? You know, they cut away stuff.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
she said, I would want to know about how it changed the way we see cities. And I was like, oh, that's quite a very interesting question. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, the empty cities, you could see them for the first time. And I thought that was a really interesting idea. And it made me think about the way that you have approached this topic, which is with your sociologist, anthropologist hats on, but also as the architect as well, that thinking about standing back from the thing that is so close to us. And do you feel like COVID was that opportunity? In a way, it was an opportunity for once for us to kind of see the city, and then we can start to act, because urbanization is such a racing phenomenon. It's like so busy, we can't really stop to think about what we're doing, how it's unfolding in front of us, it's sprawling everywhere and going up in crazy places and weird shapes and so on. And COVID was like this moment for the researcher where, in a way, to use your phrase, the city becomes a laboratory. Like we put the city in a laboratory and explore it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we in a way started looking at cities in a different way when they became empty. And your daughter is very right at spotting this difference. It's like what anthropologists say, making strange. It was a situation of making strange cities because they're rarely empty and unpopulated by people, things, and technology. So this was a quite revealing moment for everyone, I think, both for researchers in the urban field, but also for everyone involved in city and urban experiences. And this revealed aspects of city dynamics, of city politics, of cities' vitalities that were probably not that visible before. So there was, I think, the pandemic indeed made visible aspects of social life and urban dynamics that were perhaps there, but we were not completely aware of the need to address these aspects and these issues. In that sense, the city became indeed a big laboratory for testing in a way things, but primarily for capturing the virus, right? All these kind of settings and dispositives in the city were primarily there to capture the virus, to spot it, to identify, to detect it, and to control it. And this also has triggered different changes in the city.
Yeah, for sure. I want to come back to that, particularly this word that you used just there, this dispositifs, which I'm interested in understanding a little bit better. And I think it relates to the last time we spoke, we were talking about Bruno Latour, obviously, in your book with Routledge on Bruno Latour for architects, and obviously there's connections there. Your work, I think, is a development of Latourian thinking. So, but I want to come back to that. But I just wanted to go to this idea of the way that you do research at a time like this, because you're right, the city became strange. It was. But we were also banned from it. We were barred from it. And doing things, particularly anthropological things, became complex because, well, encountering people became much more difficult. And so I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, and then perhaps also talk about this thing that you talk about in the book, which is the documenting the present, and you call it theorizing the present without historicizing it. Which is really interesting idea. And I've wondered for many years about writing a kind of archaeology of the present, which sounds absurd and slightly pretentious. But that's kind of my USP. But so I would kind of really like to understand that, like, how do you document the present? How do you document the present? How do you, when a city is made strange, how do you talk about it in the present? So these kind of techniques, I suppose, or tactics of methodological tactics that you employ in this situation.
Yeah, that's a very good question indeed. And it was, of course, it's much more difficult to write about a phenomena that is unfolding rather than about something that has happened in the past, and conceptualizing it, writing about this when the dust has settled down is, I would say, much easier. And I was writing the book during the pandemic, and I was researching is talking to different practices, architectural practices during the pandemic. And this was a moment when we were all suffering from the effects of the virus, and the pandemic was still kind of very present, and there were a lot of uncertainties, agitations, and passions around the presence of this virus. And in that sense, it was quite interesting because the virus in a way introduced a different understanding of history as historicity, not history as a linear kind of progression of time, of events, but this historicity is something different. It's more related to the idea of event, this idea that something happens in time. And this event, the pandemic that happened, started transforming our lives, cities. There were many different connections, mediations, bifurcations in time. And it's very different. What we experienced is very different than the kind of linear, official, traditional concept of history with capital H. We might say, which is history understood as the steady and irreversible or linear, let's say, course of events related to steady passage of time, the creation of irreversible situations, or the dismissal of doctrines, and the beginning of new eras, let's say, this kind of linear understanding of history, of the line of time. And here the situation was completely different. I was in the middle of these unfolding events, unable to make sense of them, and yet trying to make sense of what is happening in spite of the uncertainties. And it definitely gave me a different perspective and a different way to talk about how this virus made history, history understood as historicity, obviously, and how non-humans like viruses could trigger events that are connected to historicity. In that sense, it was an approach that very much relied on accounts of either ethnographic accounts or documentary reports related to the unfolding events of the pandemic. As far as the city is concerned, a lot of materials related to spatial transformations in the city, video reports. As far as architectural practices are concerned, I used a method, an ethnographic method, which I had to adapt to the situation of the pandemic, because the practices I worked with were at a distance. So I was able to interview 130 architectural practices from 40 different countries. So they were all over the world. Obviously, I was not able to travel to those places during the pandemic due to the restrictions, but even in normal times, I would not be able to travel to all those countries to interview architects or to conduct ethnography in their practices. And that's why, to understand what happens in these practices, how they adapt to online working and all the restrictions to the pandemic, I devised a small experiment, which I call an experiment of distant ethnography. I just sent them a questionnaire, which consisted of one question, one request. I asked them to describe ethnographically one specific situation from their practice, and to tell me how they survived, how they managed to work as architects during the pandemic, so that this specific situation, they had to pick one situation. So there was, of course, a limitation to this method to be able to illustrate their working routines, one particular change they introduced, or one particular innovation they introduced in practice, which helped them to continue to work on or design together. I call this method distant because I was not able to be there to observe how they do it, how they introduce a new technology, or how they adapt to this restrictions. Usually ethnography involves close participant observation in practice, immersed in office for a long time, slow engagement with the practitioners, but this was not possible in this case. So I had to adapt ethnography to a set of techniques that could help me to get a sense about the lived experience of the architects in all those different locations in so many different countries, and understand what actually happened in practices and how they adapted to the restrictions. And the responses were amazing. So first I asked them only to write one page and not more, to choose only one situation, one particular key change in their practice, one moment to illustrate a new way of doing things, a particular adjustment they did. And they chose different aspects. The richness was amazing as well. So some architects talk about technical adjustments, technical innovations. Other talks talked about different modes of visualization, different new relational dynamics between architectural firms and connected industries. Some practices decide to focus more on the creative habits and the creative routines and how they adapt it. Their creative working habits to the new condition. Others focus more on projects that were currently under construction and how they had to do adjustments to be able to continue to talk to clients or to be even present on the building site and to talk to communities. So there was a range of responses, and every single practice had to choose one particular situation, one particular aspect, and to describe it ethnographically. And in that sense, it was an experiment in conducting distant ethnography, which I consider very successful.
Well, that's good. It's I mean, these critical ethnographic practices, that particularly ones based around the internet, have become absolutely preeminent, haven't they? And in a peculiar kind of way, I suppose, as you say, you couldn't have traveled to 140 different practices because you'd never get a research grant to do it, and you wouldn't have enough hours in the day. So in a peculiar way, it facilitated people became very willing, I found, to discuss it. And I'm kind of interested in this idea around trauma, which I don't think has been properly, certainly not in architectural terms, been properly investigated, interrogated in terms of the effects of COVID. So certainly as something, as an educator, I'm very aware that many of my students were, their experience of lockdown and things like that was very, very difficult, very troubling. But it's an interesting idea, isn't it, that when you as an ethnographer go to architects, for example, and ask them to unpack, they really want to unload. People were really, really willing to share, which was really, that for me represented a major shift that this whole situation revealed. And another aspect, as you said earlier, of the way that COVID-19 seemed to expose realities that were there already, but we didn't see. That people, for example, wanted to talk.
Absolutely. Yeah. There were a lot of aspects indeed. Connected to difficulties or trauma in practice, but there was also willingness to take the positive, to take to turn some of those challenges into lessons that could be useful for architectural practice in the future. There was also this kind of willingness and positive thinking.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's heartening to hear. But there's a key term, I think, well, from my reading of a key term in architecture and COVID in your book, which is this word dispositifs. And you've mentioned this already. You mentioned it once. And I wanted to know, you describe them as a physical mechanism and a heterogeneous ensemble consisting of architectural forms, spatial instructions, administrative measures, discourses, technologies, and institutions, which enhances and maintains the exercise of power within a pandemic society. And you go on to talk about it as a network of relations. And you've touched on this before, where you talked about our experience of the urban in relation to technology and the built environment. And I just wondered if you could sort of help me understand a little bit more what this word is about, where I suppose it comes from, and its usefulness in terms of understanding architectural space and built environment.
Yeah, this is an important term indeed. It's a concept, dispositif is a concept coming from Michel Foucault, inspired by his work, and then further on developed in the work of Gilles Deleuze. And this concept introduces a system of relations between all these elements that you mentioned, between discourses, technologies, institutions, architectural forms in this particular case. And as such, it is not an enclosed space. So the dispositif is not a building, it's not an enclosed space, but it's just a multilinear setting. We can imagine it more as a web, as a composed of lines of different nature, of lines of visibility, of positioning bodies and objects, of following directions, of tracing things. So it's more or less a spatial machine. We can sense. We can imagine it as a spatial machine, as a setting that, when introduced in the city in pandemic conditions, these spatial settings, very specific spatial settings, dispositifs, try to, in a way, influence us as city dwellers on what to do, how to walk, how to respect distance, how to see things in the city, how to position our bodies according to each other, and how to relate differently in the city. And as these dispositives were everywhere in the city, in train stations, in car parks, in theaters, so all these kind of dispositives, in a way, when we were experiencing their guidance, we, in a way, took part in a completely different spatial choreography of urban life. In a way, they directed this different spatial choreography, because once we were in, let's say, supermarkets, we were guided in a very specific way of what to do and how to follow arrows, or we had to follow special requirements for distancing when we talk to our neighbors. So that was another dispositif. We were constantly tested as carriers of the virus. That was another dispositif. So we were constantly moving from one dispositif to another, and this, in a way, dictated a very specific spatial choreography of urban life. In these dispositives were also dispositives of capture, because and they were everywhere in buildings or in urban spaces, because they primarily had as a purpose to capture the virus. But it's very interesting, because by capturing the virus, they were also capturing us as humans in this kind of dispositives, and this was a game of a double capture, so to say, and this also gradually modified the conditions of urban life, but also the conditions through which to design cities. So in that sense, the concept of dispositives really helps us to understand what happened to our cities during the pandemic, and that we were never actually in one particular enclosed space, in one particular building or in one particular urban space, but we were constantly moving from one dispositive to another. And in that sense, we were part of a strange spatial choreography.
Yeah, for sure. And I love this use of this word choreography as a way of describing the everyday practices of life. And this, I really enjoy as you were talking, I was thinking about this connection between this idea of historicity, which you've talked about, this idea of events causing the bifurcation of possibilities in a way, and this idea of the dispositive as well. So they seem to match, it seems to be the natural way of understanding these things together. That, if history is about events, then you're going to need to understand these mechanisms, which are the consequences of the events. And they could have been otherwise, but because of the event, they weren't otherwise in a way. Am I
yeah, absolutely, yeah. Absolutely, yeah, that's a good way of connecting it, actually very beautiful way of connecting it, as we were never in a linear space, yeah, just like history was never linear. We were in the middle of it and everything was changing, and we were in this kind of historical moment of bifurcation. And in the city, we were never in one particular space, but we were constantly moving, and this strange choreography was also related to a choreography of bifurcations in the city. So it's very much connected indeed, yeah.
And it comes, there's a sort of an interesting idea as well, isn't there? Sort of an idea of generate this positive say they generated a new mode of being, a new series of choreographed habits, which they were not, individuals were not actually masters of it. I think that was perhaps one of the most traumatic or most complex things about it, was to realize that perhaps even in pre-pandemic times, one's behavior was mediated and choreographed, curated by forces, techno-spatial, built environment, political, administrative forces, which one isn't by and large aware of. And what COVID-19 did, and these very strange stories that we were telling and behaviors that we were undertaking, culturally situated, 2 meters versus 6 feet, for example, were actually, they sort of evidence to us our in a way our powerlessness, but also our codependency as citizens of an urban realm.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. We witnessed this amazing alliance between new alliance between politics, technologies, urban life, governmentality, and how impossible it is to disentangle one from the other, society from science, from politics. So this entanglement was better witnessed during the pandemic, although in a traumatic way, as you say.
Now, one of the so the book is organized into 3 principal chapters, isn't it? With a conclusion looking at which is entitled, and I think really interestingly, Architectural Research Extended to Things, which I think is a subject almost in its own right, and a really amazing idea. But one of the chapter 2 is you call the laboratory. I'm going to struggle here. The laboratorization of urban space, the city as a laboratory. And I wanted to, and I put in my notes to you, what that sort of implies is all of the things of a laboratory, which is to say scientists and scientific equipment and scientific procedures and scientific modes of behavior, rituals in a way, but also that the city became a site of pathology. I was living in a coastal town, and people escaped the city very quickly. And obviously there was a substantial differential between urban spaces and rural spaces in terms of logically the way that this thing played out. So I did want to understand this idea of the city as laboratory a little bit better, but I also wanted to think about this paradox, the city being both a safe space and not very safe at all.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, we indeed witnessed this unprecedented laboratorization. And by laboratory here, I mean a space where we can inverse the balance of forces. Yeah. The virus is powerful everywhere in the city. But if we can create a laboratory setting, a small laboratory dispositive where the virus could be detected and captured, and therefore we could find a way to dominate the virus, this balance of forces will be reversed. Because the virus was so present everywhere and so powerful, and every day we were presented with these statistics, very dark statistics of people affected or casualties, and this presence and this power of the building of the virus was very present in the city. That's why we needed the laboratorization, so that we can inverse, that we can create those spaces, those niches in the city everywhere where the virus can be detected and in a way controlled. And in that sense, building these dispositives, this small laboratory type of dispositives everywhere in urban space and in buildings was very important in this war against the virus that we started. And what was interesting is that they all adapted different tactics, protocols, gestures, we might say, from the laboratory and from the field of medical diagnosis. And all these technologies, gestures, and protocols, such as wearing masks, for instance, or disinfecting, or temperature measuring, or quarantining. So these are all practices and protocols that we usually follow either in a laboratory or in a hospital. And suddenly we saw those practices and protocols migrating into the city, and they started reshaping spatial practices and urban practices. So by laboratorization, in a way, I mean that on the one hand, we as urban dwellers, as citizens, were turned into subjects, but also participants in these experiments on the virus, because we were constantly part of it. We were constantly tested, submitted to more and more tests, given instructions what to do, what not to do, and we were part of these laboratory settings as well, captured alongside the virus. We saw a lot of changes in urban traditional typologies, a lot of new pictograms, signposting systems, new technologies, new materials, and all these new pictograms and technologies, they also began they became part of the city, and we also started to share the city with these contactless technologies and temperature robots and devices for counting bodies in cities. And this was also an aspect that was very connected to the laboratorization. And finally, this also redefined our link to non-humans, like viruses and, of course, other diseases. And we started thinking about this link to non-humans and the importance of non-humans in cities, as the practices in cities, the spatial kind of dynamics in cities were changing. And these are the dimensions of laboratorization that were important and were kind of interesting to describe.
Yeah, that issue around non-humans is really fascinating, because, of course, there's a sort of sense about the city, isn't there, which is that it is an escape from the tyranny of nature. You know, the unpredictability, the uncontrolledness of nature, and we can create ecologies, urban ecologies for ourselves, where we are masters or mistresses, and we can be in charge. And then this thing comes along, unseen, undetected, random and it's not man-made. Well, maybe it is, but anyway, it's in some sense what it is it kind of disenchanted our sense of self-fulfillment, self-control, our mastery, and became a very unsettling thing for a lot of people.
Absolutely.
Where you've got not where you've invited in, it's almost like an animal, it's like a wild animal, unpredictable in that sense. And I quite liked that aspect of I quite like that aspect of this idea of the non-human. But I did want to go on to this issue around that you've talked about in terms of the laboratorization. The way you've described it in the book and speaking now is one of a measure of bodily discipline, that we became quite disciplined in the way that we occupied space, the way that we moved through space, the way that we interacted with each other and with things, and even the way that we interacted with knowledge became quite disciplined, both through choice and through opportunity. And I wanted to know, and I wanted to know whether your research and whether what the book had to say about that kind of disciplinary thing, because it wasn't even. Not everybody was disciplined in the same way. Not everybody's behavior was modified. Obviously, our prime minister or ex-prime minister, for example, and his minions didn't suffer from the same disciplinary protocols. So I was wondering if there was anything there that kind of Foucaultian idea of the disciplinary city.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, everyone responded to this differently, and people were affected by these instructions differently. I suppose what was in a way something that we all shared is perhaps the way we started experiencing local environments like neighborhoods, because suddenly we discovered our neighborhoods. Maybe we visited parks and shops in our neighborhoods that we have never visited before. We started walking more, cycling more, and there was this phenomena of the 15-minute city that was also very much discussed during the pandemic, which is an idea that was promoted before the pandemic, even advocated, I would say, back in 2016, I think, with the works of Moreno, and more as a kind of response to the climate crisis. But now it was much more developed and much more relevant. The fact that that's the in a way the city of the future. The city will become very compact. It will be a 15-minute city where everything will be at a kind of minimal travel distance from our houses. So everything like restaurant, parks, hospitals, cultural venues. And this, of course, is an idea that was accelerated during the pandemic and implied an understanding of urban life related to more density, proximity, diversity, we might say. And there were different versions, 15 minutes, 17 minutes, different versions of chrono-urbanism. But at the same time, some critics were very much in favor of this kind of big idea of the disappearance of the end of the big city. And there was a big polemic around this topic, whether the city centers, big kind of metropolitan city centers will disappear and the city is dead. A lot of scholars proclaim the death of the city. Others argue that we're kind of very a very much in a hurry of kind of endorsing this idea of the death of the city, but it's not an idea that can survive, because the younger people will be back to the city. And there will be, again, after the pandemic, flocking back to cities to experience kind of more the cultural kind of buzz of big cities, and to reestablish their professional network. So there was this kind of debate in a way that the pandemic in a way triggered. And I think it was interesting to see the kind of the two sides of the problem, and to really reflect on the future of cities, and whether cities will really bounce back after the pandemic, as they have done in the past, perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, that's still probably an open question. I was thinking about this idea of the, I've been wondering about how the city survives when obviously things like the economy tanked during COVID-19, and now we're reaping that whirlwind with the economic situation being probably rather a little less shaky, a little more shaky than it was before the pandemic, as a consequence of some of the things that were done. But I was thinking more about this idea of the way that, to me, the logic of the way that we build cities was kind of revealed to be a fiction. And it was kind of, there's a kind of sense, I suppose, in this progressive idea, this times arrow idea of history, that the cities that we have are the inevitable product of all the things that have come before. But really, I think the world kind of ticked on just fine without the City of London and the City of New York. And it's sort of, we've got to re-enchant ourselves with the fiction of the need of the city, rather than actually believing it to be true. If you know what I mean, we've kind of got, we've become disenchanted in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's why it was a moment. There was in a way a lot of manifestos around this topic, a lot of manifestos around technologies, around the development of architectural practice, kind of big statements, perhaps because we were still trying to make sense of what was happening. Yeah, and at the level of architectural discourse, urban theorists, and urban scholars were kind of quite quick at producing those statements. But I think all these statements were a little bit exaggerated, perhaps, as you say. And on the other hand, there was this tendency of thinking more about the slow rhythm of life, about retiring to villages and green spaces, the kind of more ecological urbanism concept that was had also a revival during the pandemic, and also made us question the assumptions on the basis of which we believed in big cities before, as you say, this disenchantment that we all experienced.
Yeah, for sure. Just one more thing that you've already touched on it, you've already addressed it, I think, very beautifully when you're talking about your methodological approach. But I thought it might be quite interesting to kind of, if you could speak about perhaps some of your main findings, and whether you had done follow-on research, I suppose, on whether these changes to practice had persisted, whether there had been a substantive change in the way that we do architecture, or whether there was a kind of make, do and mend quality to what was done by architects during the crisis. And then I also was quite interested in this idea that perhaps you could reflect on, perhaps you'd had thoughts upon this idea that one of the things that we did, and you've talked about, these manifestos, and you used the phrase, people making sense of what was happening. Is there a sense of architects making meaning out of the mundane shifts in their practices, a sort of ascribing to it, and this is not in any way critical, but ascribing to it greater profundity, not only in what they were now doing, but in the things that they had done in terms of their practice, giving them depth and sort of consciousness, which previously had been intuitive practices.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there were a lot of changes, which I will not call radical changes or like big shifts or big revolutions, like the digital turn, for instance. All these changes were very small, very minimal. But they, in a way, reshaped the working habitat of architectural practices. And architects reflected very honestly on these transformations. They told me real stories of difficulties, of struggle, of specific innovations and adjustments they had to put in place to be able to continue to work. So they talked very honestly about new formats of teamwork, new ways of communicating, brainstorming, documentary exchange. So all this kind of very practical changes in practice that they had to introduce. In a way, they had to re-architecture the architectural setting of practice. All this kind of spatial and tactics and techniques that define architectural practice had to be entirely, in a way, reshaped and rethought. And in terms of findings, I could mention perhaps three aspects. The first one is that we witness a very curious return to, I might say, forgotten or obsolete techniques of designing. And in a way, the pandemic revived the profile of the architect as a perfectionist, perhaps, this kind of pensive, reflective architect who thinks more than acts, the architect that writes before designing, not because action is negated, but because it was temporary, impossible. Architects started delegating more and more to verbal and written expression, because they were working from distance and they missed, all of them, they missed the magic of the office. A lot of practices were telling me there's something magical in the office that happens when you're actually there and you can see the others discussing, you can see the gestures, you can see the production of the model. There's something that passes from model to architect, from mind to drawing, and this togetherness was indeed missed. And because they couldn't be there and design and draw together, they relied much more on verbal communication, on storytelling, on written expression, and they started articulating ideas much more in written and verbal way rather than in drawings, which is something that is quite curious. We also, in a way, saw that the pandemic freed designers from some rigid hierarchies, in some practices, especially small-scale practices, these hierarchies were entirely dismantled. And the pandemic unlocked the hidden potential of the younger designers. They were delegated with much more responsibilities. The makers were turned into writers. They were asked to write about projects. The shy architects were turned into vocal, the invisible into visible. So we see all these kind of curious reversals in practice, again, especially at the level of small-scale practices. And this inevitably of course, changed the process of design. But these are all these kind of returns also to sketching, to verbal expression, to storytelling are only small changes, very small. They triggered small variations at the level of the practice. not big transformations, we might say. A second aspect is all the technologies that were introduced. And some of these technologies were available, I might say, since the first digital turn, the so-called first digital turn. Other tools and technologies were available since the second digital turn, but they were simply not introduced, not implemented in practices. Some developments were kind of embryonic, but were not fully executed in practice. Because of lockdown and other restrictions, architects had much more time to reflect on the technologies they use in practice. And they started introducing these new digital tools, apps, software. One example perhaps is BIM, because BIM, as we know, as a technology, was introduced in 2000, but kind of officially it came with the second digital turn. But we can see that it was not introduced in many practices around the world. And we see now that some practices, and I'm talking about large-scale practices with a lot of projects, which actually require BIM more than others, they started implementing BIM now during the pandemic. Other examples, for instance, project management tools like Asana, which was known since 2008, were introduced only now. So we see that these are kind of small intra-digital developments. They're not big digital turns. And again, here there were a lot of statements that were exaggerated. A lot of critics said perhaps we're witnessing another digital revolution. Maybe we're experiencing the third digital turn now. But I wouldn't say this is the case on the basis of the responses I received from architects. These are again small variations in practice, and it's too early to say whether this kind of newly introduced technologies will really have an impact on the way we will design in the future, on the way the buildings will look like in the future. And very briefly, the third kind of aspect was more connected to the reflexivity of architects on how to connect to clients and communities in a different way. And they had to be very resourceful there, and they had to think about new ways of crafting this relationship with clients and reconnecting with communities. And some of them even invented designed their own proxies, their own surrogate. An architectural practice from Australia, they were telling me it's impossible to communicate with Aboriginal communities in Australia from a distance, from the kind of a Zoom screen. And they wanted to continue this project, and they literally had to find someone in the local community, train him to act and behave like an architect. So this person became the proxy of the architect, dressed as an architect, talked as an architect. And the architectural practice in Sydney just directed a strange play from a distance where they actually witness someone else doing their work on the ground. So this is just an example that illustrates this kind of resourcefulness that we witness in architectural practices.
Amazing. It's really interesting. I mean, I want to just come back to the title of the book as a last thing, which is this, which you talk about at the beginning of the book, which is architecture after COVID. And it's not architecture in the lee of COVID, or COVID having gone, but architecture after COVID has arrived, and how it's changed everything. And I suppose there is the question I want to ask is, has there been further feedback from your research, further learning from your research, which indicates the endurance of some of these changes to the city, to practice, and to the sort of nature and identity of how we perceive and engage with the built environment?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So we can see that some practices are still implementing techniques that were developed during the pandemic. So to say, online techniques are now migrating offline. Yeah. So some adjustments, some kind of improvements in their working methods, which they found very efficient during the pandemic, are now in a way migrating in the kind of offline modality of practice. And we witness also lots of hybrid practices in place. So this is one thing that in a way is happening now. To what extent these changes that I mentioned will have an impact on the way that buildings will look like in the future, it's quite early to say, but one thing is sure, that practices had the time to slow down, step back, and rethink their working habits, which will definitely, and rethink their working culture as well. And this will definitely now help them to improve their working methods and perhaps accelerate the way they work, improve the way they work. At the moment, I think at this stage, perhaps we have much more reflexivity at the level of the city and at the level of society, much more kind of thinking about the pandemic and what kind of in a way effects it had on cities. And I think the reflection is at a different level now that it was during the pandemic, perhaps because we are now taking a distance, we're in a kind of much more post-COVID situation. And I think I will probably repeat myself, but the pandemic convinced us to what extent all these non-humans like viruses have an impact on our cities, and this in a way will change the way we perhaps will design cities and will design urban space in the future, because this awareness about non-humans, about another virus that might come in the city, or another non-human of a strange nature that can intrude in the city and can start changing it again and start reshaping urban relationships, this awareness is there, and we still continue to, in a way, think about it. I want to add just one more change, which kind of came to my mind because you were talking about technologies. Because during the pandemic, we kind of got this habit of living in a contactless environment, which I think is quite interesting for architects, right? And we are now, in a way, battling with this pandemic habit and many other pandemic habits, let's say. But with the greater awareness of hygiene in the city, the main purpose of design was to create a physical environment where there's no human contact, where everything is contactless. And this kind of contactless design environment became so present, so pervasive, that now we have to convince people that it's okay to touch surfaces, because the habit is there, because they're so afraid of touching the handrail or the elevator that there's almost the risk of them falling down, and all this kind of skepticism and fear, I would say, of touching support surfaces is there, and it's something that designers are also kind of very much reflecting on. And at the level of architectural discourse, in a connected way, what we witness now is how the obsession with illness, in a way, redefine the limits of architecture and the architectural aesthetic. So we don't think of architecture any longer as a container or just as form and function. But because we witness a completely different architectural aesthetics emerging during the pandemic, the kind of aesthetics that was related to architecture understood as the distribution of circuits of air and the air droplets and all these kind of flows and movements related to of course, the circulation of the virus, but also the constitution of social bubbles, the contactless ways of kind of regulating urban life. And that is, I think, an architecture and a flow and movements that is much more kind of, in a way, this aesthetics of flow and movement is much more powerful now that architecture understood as form and function. And I would say we can fully understand the impact of the pandemic now, because this kind of aesthetic is having a great impact on us as designers and urban scholars now, I believe.
That's really good. I'm really glad you added that. That's a wonderful addition, and an area I've not really thought so much about. So thank you very much for that. And thank you for this wonderful conversation, Albena. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you, you too. Yeah, say thanks to your daughter for the question. Yeah, it was a great question.
Not Latour, but Latourian perhaps. Thank you to Albena for her service, joining me once again on the podcast, and to Bloomsbury for the book. There are links to Albena's online self and the book in the podcast description as ever, and also to Albena's previous visit to the show in the first season when we discussed her book on Bruno Latour. Please do share this episode, of course, and stay safe. Thanks for listening. Cheers.